Hi, I'm Iwan Fox and welcome to the latest 4BR Review podcast, where I'm joined by my colleague Chris Thomas to chat about what has, what is, and what will be going on in the brass band world. For this latest episode, we are back talking about the music, and in particular what our test piece choices tell the wider musical world about us. It follows the recent British Open Championship, which saw bands perform the Prokofiev-inspired Star-Crossed Lovers by Stephen Roberts and the Bliss-fest of works at the Cheltenham National Finals. It also comes after the recent announcement of the 2026 Regional Championship set works and those that will be performed at the 104th British Open Spring Festival next May. In addition, major championships around Europe have revealed their test piece choices with works by established composers such as Edward Gregson, Thierry Deleruyelle, Derek Bourgeois and Thomas Doss to be heard at elite level events in the coming weeks. So, with the Royal Albert Hall National Final on the horizon and those other events to showcase our music, are we really showing the wider musical world what we have the ambition to seek different avenues of musical expression, as well as the desire to encourage new voices for the medium? As always, your views and opinions are key to that, so please be part of the live discussion by posting your comments in the YouTube comment box on the screen. We'd love to hear from you. So, great to be back, Chris, for what is going to be a very busy few months of major contesting events.
It is you, and we're going to be listening to a lot of contest pieces, aren't we? we've got the Royal Albert Hall coming up first and foremost. Edward Gregson's Symphony in Two Movements. I'm going to be in Utrecht for the Dutch Nationals at the end of October, where we've got another Gregson Fest, Gregson pieces in every section there, including Rococo variations in the championship section. And then you're going to be in Sidis, I believe, at the same time. Mm-hmm.
I'm really looking forward to that. So first of all, then, given from what we are going to be discussing over the next hour, of course, our congratulations go to the Brighouse and Rastrick Band on winning the 171st
Indeed.
British Open Championships. There they were. Absolutely fantastic performance by them. I think the victory told us a lot about their quality and that of their MD, Professor David King. But I think the question is, what about the music? What did that tell us about what brass bands have to offer as a movement? What do brass bands sound like to the wider musical world?
Well, you could argue that the music was a safe bet, Ewan, in many ways. I think it appealed to the audience in the contest. I think generally the feedback that I heard from around the hall was fairly positive about the piece. But of course, we don't have the wider world sitting listening to music at contests. That's part of the problem. And I think if you took Star-Crossed Lovers out of its context as a test piece for the British Open, I'm not sure that many people would truly know what to make of it, to be quite honest.
Context, I think, is going to be key to the conversation that we're having this evening. We're going to cover hopefully a number of topics, and hopefully people will be coming back to us with their views and opinions. And we do hope it doesn't become a binary conversation. It's not us and them. It's not right and wrong. There must be context to everything. There are different shades of opinion, etc. So that's what we're really looking for from people. But going back to the British Open then, you're correct in saying the two things there. The balance for events such as the British Open at any really brass band competition is the balance between what they have to offer musically and what they've got to consider financially. And, you know, the balance with something like the British Open Championships with its long history, they've been very successful in doing that ever since they had, you know, the event at Bellevue, then it went to Free Trade Hall, Bridgewater Hall, and now it's Symphony Hall. They sold over 2,000 tickets yet again for that event. So that tells you something. And as you said, it may have been a safe choice. Stephen Roberts has written, that was the third time that he's written a work for it. And then he also did the Holst as part of the Planets also. So in that way, you've always got to balance that out, haven't you? Because on the one hand, we want to reach out to audiences, but we've got an audience of our own, which we've really got to appeal to as well. So getting that right is really the key to whether or not we can push further forward and show greater ambition.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Roberts wrote what he was asked to write, Ewan. That's the bottom line. And, I think in the context of the British Open, as you say, it is the best attended of all of our contests. I mean, there isn't another contest that would pack a hall out. I mean, you can't compare the British Open and Symphony Hall with the Royal Albert Hall, for instance, of the National Championship Finals, which, you know, seats 3 times as many people. The Symphony Hall was full, and to my way of thinking, that is a contest at which you can afford to think a little outside the box with your choice of music and your choice of test piece. And looking back, I mean, I scribbled a few notes down here. I mean, we had at the British Open in 2002, we had the Maunsell Forts, John McCabe. Way back in 1994, we had John McCabe's Salamander.
Great piece, yeah.
Way back in 1980, we had Robert Simpson's Energy, which was pretty revolutionary at the time. Came 5 years after Fireworks, of course, which we talked about in the last podcast. So looking back, I mean, we're going back 30-odd years there, and there were test pieces that pushed boundaries, that brought composers in from outside the medium. And I honestly think that this is a contest, of all contests, the British Open is a contest that we can afford to try to be progressive, that we can try to break down musical boundaries that we need to be very aware of and very conscious of.
So linking that ambition, as you say, to go back, hopefully, people say about a golden age of test piece and things like that, but in between those pieces, in that event and other events, there were pieces that people have just about forgotten as soon as after they've, 2 days after they were actually played as well. So not everyone is an absolute bullseye with regards to that. But I think you're right in that respect. We've got to show that ambition, really, to try something, I wouldn't say particularly greatly different, because in terms of, we call avant-garde music or contemporary music, etc., we are still way behind where the classical music is actually going, what we could possibly go at. As you say, if you go back as far, and I wrote a piece with Tim Newton, who did something in the programme from 1975, 50 years ago, Fireworks.
Yeah.
And when you listen to it now, it almost sounds dated in it, but at the time it caused a great furore out there as well. So we've got those pieces that we hopefully can really either reconnect with, or get composers who write in that different way, in that different manner, and have that ambition to actually showcase those voices there. And interesting, we talk about Stephen Roberts, as you say, that he's already done 3 works for the British Open Championships. But interestingly, and I know you've heard pieces of his own original works.
I have.
Very interesting. One called The Other Sound of Silence, which was used at the Swiss Open Championships. So, he's a composer. I wouldn't say that he's been pigeonholed into it, is that people think that's all he can write. He's got such a wide variety of writing talent that we hopefully could hear again.
Stephen Roberts is an incredibly talented composer, and I have heard other music by him. He has his own voice. I know he has his own voice. I've heard other brass band pieces by him. I've heard orchestral pieces by him as well. He's had pieces performed on Radio 3 by orchestras, which I've heard. And he does have his own voice. And that's one of the things that deeply, deeply frustrates me about what we had at the British Open, which is a talented composer with the ability to write in his own voice, but very deliberately asked to write in a voice which is retrograde musically, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, we're looking backwards, not forwards. And we can't afford to do that. As I said, the British Open, of all contests, the British Open is a contest where we could afford to look at a more progressive test piece. And it's only if we do that we can possibly even begin to think about, from people outside the brass band medium, looking in with any interest on what we do from a contesting point of view.
I think it's really important from that as well. And interesting, not just talking about the British Open Championships. I remember a few years ago, I'll have to recall a bit of a story, a bit of a name drop here with this one, I have to say. I was with a chap called Sir Ian Stoutska. Now, Sir Ian Stoutska is a man who set up live music now with Sir Yehudi Menuhin. A wonderful organisation which has inspired, countless people to take up music absolutely years. He was a driving force behind the Philharmonia Orchestra and also the London Symphony Orchestra when they went to the Barbican. I talked once with Howard Snell about him and to him about Howard Snell. He had the greatest respect about that. This was a man who knows his music inside out. He came to the Albert Hall a few years ago. I won't say exactly what piece was being played. And his disappointment was not to be there and listen to it. He just said, literally, why are you playing music like this?
Yeah. Yeah.
Of all the opportunity that we got, all the musicianship, the talent that we got there. And he was saying, it was literally music to go down the drain. He was so disappointed because he had heard, he was an educated person, and he knew what we could actually achieve as a brass band, as a medium. And that was something really stuck with me ever since. That if we actually just, keep producing these stereotypical pieces, or very narrow-minded pieces, and then we try to present them in a different way, how are we then going to get away from the contest environment into the concert halls, back into the Royal Albert Hall, back into the proms, etc. But all we're doing is actually showcasing pieces that we think virtuosic and are fantastic, but to the wider world mean very little at all.
Well, either that, Iwan, or you talk about the financial side of it with contest organisers, etc. I was talking to somebody 3 or 4 weeks ago now, a well-known banding personality, who expressed concern and genuine concern that Edward Gregson's Symphony in Two Movements would not attract an audience to the Royal Albert Hall. And effectively, what we were saying there was that this is a composer whose music has been played at the Royal Albert Hall since, 1978 connotation? 77,
yeah.
And here we are in 2025 questioning that very same composer in terms of whether his music can put, to quote, bums on seats. And that's a worrying trend. I mean, the comment was made with very genuine intentions, and it's a very worrying thing if we, as people in the banding movement who care about it, have concerns that a composer like Edward Gregson is not going to put bums on seats in the Royal Albert Hall. I mean, that's a really worrying thing.
Well, we've got our first comments coming in. Sandy Smith, of course, as we know, well known, is somebody, and he's somebody we'll be talking about a little bit later on, because he is very much involved in this conversation and the way in which banding is moving. And he's got different viewpoints, possibly to us in many ways, but very constructive in the way in which he thinks about the music. He says, if we want to impress the wider musical world with our test pieces, they need to be written by respected composers from the wider musical world. And that leads me on to a point, it's a point really well made. I'm not just saying this, but within the programme that I did for the British Open Championships, we've had no female composer since 1962, and that was Helen Perkin. There she is, appears on the screen there. There's been no female composer on there. And then leading on from that, as you talk about in the wider field, and these are just female composers. Evelyn Wallen, Master of Her Majesty's Music, written for brass band, heard on the first night of the proms, of course, Evelyn Wallen, that part of it there. Judith Weir, Judith Bingham, Cheryl Francis Holt, Roxana Pafufnik, Charlotte Bray, Anna Klein, Danny Howard, Sally Beamish, Lucy Pankhurst. We've got this whole list of female composers we literally have not touched as Evelyn Wallen on there. Somehow we almost say, thanks very much indeed. We take one work off them and then leave alone. And not just female composers, composers from all different areas that we could possibly show the ambition and say, and write us something which then makes that connection, as we're in context, makes that wider connection to an audience away from the traditional brass band contest environment.
Yeah, no, Sandy's absolutely right in what he says. The only way that we will gain respect in the wider musical world is not to force on an audience pieces that effectively are as unadventurous as some of the pieces that we've heard of late. So Sandy's absolutely right. We can't expect to be taken seriously if we don't start to think outside the box. And we've lost that, Iwan. We go back again to the John McCabe's and the Robert Simpsons, and even the Edward Gregsons back in the day. Fortunately, Eddie's still very much writing, but we've lost that willingness to search and to go outside the box and to not push boundaries beyond their limits. We know that brass band audiences do have their limits, but nonetheless we've gone way too far the other way. We've gone in a negative direction. And we've got to think really seriously about that going forward.
It's a point that he takes up as well. He says that this will mean a sea change in what many consider the necessary components of what makes a test piece. And I think, again, talking about context and way in which we view the music itself, we view music as a test piece rather than just a piece of music. So our expectations of what we think that we need from that music and what we need from a composer are maybe even completely different to what the composer wishes to write for us in the first place.
Yeah.
So, and I think going back to the British Open Championships, one of the things that the people in the hall rather enjoyed, you had the first little bit of Prokofiev, which was the opening sliding chords, whatever. Within 10 seconds, you had a cadenza for the euphonium and cornet. So almost in a way, you went straight back into that stereotypical thing that we need. We need to test players for no possibly other reason than just to find out what metal, what they're made of within 15 seconds of a piece starting. And is that really the message that we want to be, showcasing to a wider audience outside the contest hall?
Well, an interesting point, Iwan, here, isn't it, is that we've got coming up a test piece at the Royal Albert Hall, Edward Gregson's Symphony in 2 Movements. That is not a conventional test piece. I think poor old Eddie would be horrified if anybody thought that it was. It's a rigorous piece of intellectual writing. It's a strongly structured work. Not a lot of solo work in it, is there? I mean, you've heard Chadiga working on the piece recently. Not a lot of solo work. It's an ensemble piece. But it's going to test bands in a different way. It's going to test bands in a way that it's a big test for MDs for a start, because I think you've really got to grasp the structure of the work, which is actually modelled on Beethoven. It's actually modelled on a Beethoven piano sonata. So you've got to have a grasp of that structure to make the piece sound convincing. And it's going to be really interesting to hear the bands playing that piece at the Royal Albert Hall, because that piece does take us away from some of what have become the conventions of some of the pieces that we've been talking about.
Flipping it back then as well, looking at not just the British Open, but the National Championship, Malcolm Wood has just come, Malcolm has put something in, he says, the Gregson work for the Royal Albert Hall is great, and I think everybody will agree with that. But as I said, it's about 19 minutes in duration. There'll be 19 bands playing it, one less this year, but still 19 bands. Would that put people off? Well, the part I would disagree with that was that it shouldn't put people off if it is 19 performances of quality that is actually being played. The problem that we have, and you do find that now within the structure of major test piece competitions, is that not so much in Europe, where it's usually 10, 11 bands at maximum, and it's a different format. Are the days of, as you say, the 19 and 20 band test piece performances ending, not because really that people don't want to hear them, but they don't want to hear bands struggling to play, fine music if they're not good enough bands. That is a wider context to that argument, of course. But you did find, even at the British Open, there was an ebb and flow of audience in and out. All right, they have their favourites at that part of it. Thankfully, there was a good core number of people that stayed in to listen to the bands. But on occasions, not just at the British Open, especially at the Albert Hall and other events, sometimes there's actually more people on stage than there are in the audience. So that part of it has also got to be taken into account. You have to really try and think to yourselves, are we trying to educate these people about the music there, or have we just got to entertain them? The balance you've got to try and get right.
I think you're right. You have got to get the balance right. But I have to say, personally, I can happily live with the fact that the piece is 19 minutes long, for the fact that it's a tremendous piece of music, which it is. I think the issue of people coming and going from contests is a very difficult one to solve, because actually that's not just about the music. It's about the fact that it's a long day. You and I sit through contests from start to finish, and we listen to every band, 18, 16, 20, whatever it is. We listen to contests completely in their entirety. Very few people will do that. So you will always get migration in and out of a hall, and that's a very, very difficult thing to solve, because inevitably they will leave the hall for bands that they think have got no realistic chance of figuring in the prizes. So that's a difficult one, and I don't think it's entirely down to the piece or the quality of the piece that's being played. It's the nature of contests.
Perhaps interesting, Dean Woods. Dean, I know, of course, does such great work with Ebba Valley Brass, not far from Tredegar, I have to say. I know they should be in band tonight practicing, I think. So, Dean, thanks for getting in contact with us. He said, looking forward to the Royal Albert Hall with Gregson's piece and with Ebba Valley Brass. It's true test, about 19 minutes will be a push for audiences, maybe, but it's a push away from the norm. And I think that's... In a way it is, in a way it isn't, because in many ways, if you played Edward Gregson's music, it isn't a push away from a lot of it what Edward Gregson has written in the past. There's an academic rigour to it. There's a quality of craftsmanship about it, which should be appreciated more. And what you're not going to get is, flying about acrobatics everywhere. There's a cerebral rigour about it that you need to understand. So
I understand the point that Dean is making, and it's not an unreasonable point. But what I feel very strongly is that what we have at the Royal Albert Hall this year is a seriously good piece of music and a very, very strong work as a piece of music, not as a test piece. I know Eddie hates the phrase test piece. He prefers the phrase set work, as he's pointed out to me many, many times.
He does, He catches me all the time. Don't say that. Sorry, Eddie.
He hates the phrase test piece. And quite rightly so, because Symphony 2 Movements isn't, as I said, it isn't a test piece. It was written as an intellectually rigorous piece of artistic writing, and that's exactly what it is. Don't make any mistakes though. It will test the bands all right. There's no question about that. But it'll just test the bands in a slightly different way, as we said. So the reality is that I personally have no issue over a 19-minute test piece, as long as the piece can stand up to 19 minutes. Now, there are many pieces that approach that we hear you and where you think, God, it's 5 minutes too long. It's just too long. It's run out of steam. And I have to say that the last 2 or 3 minutes of Star-Crossed Lovers were pretty hard going, I think. So, the point with Eddie's piece is that it's a 19-minute span of extremely high quality music, and that's going to make it worth listening to.
It is. Interestingly, Alec Gallagher, as always, Alex, great to have you with us. Again, somebody really informed. Not somebody who goes to the contests, I have to say, very rarely, but a man who really does go out and seek. I have to say, he goes to so many concerts when contemporary music is actually put on as well. Yeah. He says, Chris talks about brass band audiences. He seems to imply that the audiences come to listen to the medium rather than the music, and I think he's right. And possibly that's the first problem. As you say, like the expectation is you come to listen because you want to go and see the competition. You want to see the contest then, isn't it? And it's inherent within us, in our histories, in our DNA. But really, if the balance isn't there about the music that we actually play, in the end, you just get an ever diminishing audience.
Yes,
because if we not have got new blood coming in from that one there. And I know, Alec, I think he goes to see, I think the CSD band. They put some great performances on. Regent Brass, another one with Alan Dougie. They put great performances in. And when you go to those events and you find out who is actually writing for us and in such an interesting way, and then you think, I wouldn't mind listening to this again, or I wouldn't mind listening to this composer's work again. But we get one, maybe two pieces from them, and then that's the end. We never hear from them again. So it's a real that is a real pity. Talking about audiences and listening to a lot of bands over the weekend, Cheltenham. I was there. I listened to every band, I have to say. I did my service for the brass band.
Quite a marathon, Ewan. Quite a marathon.
I did. I couldn't feel my legs at times, I have to say, but there we are. I managed to get on. But it was enjoyable. Now, the reason for us there was the choices in its way, because, as I said a little bit earlier, it was a bit of a Bliss-fest with a little bit of Edward Gregson added into it. It's the 50th anniversary of Bliss. There they are. There's the two gents, one dead, one still very much with us. I'll leave you make up the choice what they are. 50th anniversary of the Bliss. It was an important landmark to recognise for the brass band movement. The Sir Arthur Bliss's granddaughter came to the event, who just happened to be Miss Moneypenny from a Timothy Dalton 007 movie for men of a certain age. Not just saying that was the attraction. But she came along and said that if her grandfather would have been absolutely thrilled. And it was to do with, as you say, the bands were able to find what she thought was the essence of his character. She called him an English gentleman with an American solo, the other way around, I think it was. But she said she was so thrilled to hear the bands bring it out to something which she could almost feel the personality of her grandfather coming through. And so that was a really good plus
That's a great
point.
compliment. That's a great compliment.
It was. And I have to congratulate the music panel for making those choices. They were interesting choices. Checkmate, because we all know that one there. The Suite from Adam Zero was very interesting. There was a little bit of time travel in it because Bob Childs had to turn around the Dance of Summer and the Autumn the other way around for really to make it work. But that was a really interesting one. Music from the Royal Palaces. And that was talking about music of its time and an era. That was really music of its time and an era. Just before the Queen, I think, was shown having her breakfast out of Tupperware breakfast bowls, and the mystery disappeared. That was in about 1969, I think. But it was very much music of its time. But it was
Bliss was he was a master of that ceremonial type of music, wasn't he? So,
but interestingly, they were saying they were desperately trying to get Bliss's music played on the anniversary, and then you're looking at the proms. There was a birthday fanfare, I think, that opened the proms, and I think they played the Beatitudes, it's called, I think it is. And that was and that's all that we got with Bliss in respect to his music being played at possibly the greatest showcase of classical music in the UK or even Europe. So, we did our bit to help promote Bliss, but in a strange sort of way, the classical music world didn't do its bit back in return for him.
No, well, I mean, most years you wouldn't hear any Bliss at the proms, so maybe we should be grateful for what we had, Ewan, at the end of the day. But when you think of the other fine Bliss pieces that could have been played, Colour Symphony, which has been played at the proms, probably on several occasions, I suspect. There's a wonderful big piece called Morning Heroes, I think, by Bliss as well, which is a terrific piece, which would have been fantastic in the Royal Albert Hall. But as I say, we wouldn't normally get any Bliss at all at the proms, and I think generally British music, particularly British music of that era, is now quite underrepresented at the proms. We're digressing slightly here, but I think it's true.
But it is. But I think in a way it connects it, because simply going on from that, we have talked about Edward Gregson. I know this is going to be a bit of an Eddie Gregson love fest. This is when we're going to talk about this. One of the pieces at Cheltenham was his partita from 1971, one of his early works. And talking about the piece that's now going to be played in the Royal Albert Hall, the craftsmanship, the academic rigor behind it. There was nothing cheap about it. There was no, there was no just needless virtuosity for needless sake. It was a wonderfully structured work, serious in outlook and in its intent, but so engrossing. And the bands that played it must have benefited greatly, because it asked it all about the the basics that you had to do, which tuning, intonation, starting to get all that sort of stuff there. But the best bands were able to make something of it, give it some sort of character about it. It really made for a fantastic little contest in the fourth section. And Gregson, as we say, is somebody who can span the from the classical world back to the brass band world and back and return. There's a picture of him there. We went to see him. Let's talk at the Prestige Festival. Very interesting. He is held in great respect and esteem there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Eddie is a regular visitor to the Prestige Festival. In fact, he was featured composer some years ago and was obviously featured heavily again this year in the year of his 80th birthday. We heard a wonderful piece called O Bard, which is effectively a rescoring of his second string quartet. I mean, a gloriously written piece. I mean, so many textures written for strings, an expanded version of the string quartet, literally for a larger string ensemble, but so beautifully written, as you say, that craftsmanship, Ewan, which is really special in Eddie's music, and which has been there from the start. So you can go back to pieces like Partita, as you say, some of those early pieces, Essay, etc. We'll be hearing Partita again at the Dutch National Championships in a few weeks' time, which is a fourth section test piece there. But that particular night at Prestige, it was the finale of the festival. Eddie's work received its world premiere. There was a clarinet concertino by a composer, Hugh Watkins. Now, here's an interesting composer, Ewan.
Very much so.
We had a quick chat with him on the night and actually suggested that it would be great if he was to write something for brass band. And his response was, I'd love to write something for brass band. You know, these are the composers and the people that we need to be involving. And, you know, Hugh's music is fantastically crafted. I mean, the clarinet concertina we wrote for that concert was terrific. And then we had that sitting alongside Shostakovich's Chamber Symphony. My goodness, talk about profound. But I mean, that's Rudolf Barshai's rescoring of Shostakovich's 8th-string quartet. Goodness me, it's dark. Oh,
But the interesting thing from that is when you talk to people, a lot of those people in the audience wanted to find out more about Edward Gregson. We wanted to find out more about Shostakovich and especially Hugh Watkins, I have to say. Tredegar boy, ex-Tredegar boy.
Yes, indeed.
His father taught us. So there we have, there's a bit of connection there. But interestingly, the people there, talking about that context and bringing us out into the wider music world, they knew that Edward Gregson writes fantastic music, not only for that medium, but also for the brass band medium. And they wanted to find out more about that. Hugh Watkins wanted to find out more about the brass band medium, how we could get connected to it. There are other composers out there who wish to do that, and that, as we're talking about it, put it into that context, we need these composers, once we've made that initial contact with them, somehow to follow up on it. Then get them to write, and to write what they want to write for us.
Absolutely.
Rather than us telling them what we think they should write for us. And I think that would be something.
And one of the interesting things about the Prestine Festival, Ewan, is that the music is almost completely contemporary. Yes, there are pieces that you couldn't perhaps call contemporary now, the Shostakovich being one of them, but it's largely contemporary British music. Very, very carefully curated by George Vass, who's the artistic director of the festival. You and I sat in the church in Prestine for that final concert. It was full. It was packed. It was a pretty heavyweight program in many ways that evening, and yet the hall was packed. The average age was older, which is something that we've got to think about in terms of brass bands as well. But it was the fact that there were people there that were completely open to hearing new music, you know, including 2 premieres in just that one concert, Eddie's piece and Hugh Watkins' piece.
And I think that's the key, isn't it? There is an audience out there. There's a well-informed audience out there. There's a well-informed brass band audience or potential brass band audience out there as well. But we need to capture them. We need to have the ambition to do that. So, you know, there are people who do it. Gavin Higgins, of course, a great friend of ourselves, and we've used so many stuff. I think he was at the Critics Award yesterday in London as well. You know, he is now he used to be seen as something of an outsider who was trying to make his mark within the classical music. Everybody wants him now. Everybody's after him, you know. I think he's in the Three Choirs Festival. I think he's got works right, left, and centre.
He's composer in residence, I think, or in association for the next 3 years. I think at the Three Choirs Festival.
I think he was due to go in Germany. His work with the National Orchestra of Wales Treager are recording that now next week at the Brangwyn Hall. You know, he is somebody who's really in there. So, for following on from that, then, as we're talking about going into the wider musical world and looking for composers who could possibly write for us, I have to give somebody it's a bit of a personal one, Judith Bingham. I always wish we could hear more from her because I think she is one of the most underrated writers for brass. You know, everywhere else she is lauded, and quite rightly, for her compositions, but she was so cruelly treated by the brass band movement. She was absolutely shamefully treated.
She writes so well for brass, Ewan. She writes so well for brass. I mean, you know, if you think of Prague and those pieces, and you know, the way she was treated over Prague was disgraceful. But there were other pieces, which I think there was a piece actually that Tredegar played called "These Are Our Footsteps," which Tredegar played at the Festival of Brass in Manchester last year, I think, if I remember rightly. That's another wonderful piece. She's also written terrific pieces for orchestral brass as well. There's a piece for brass and choir called "Salt in the Blood," which is all based on sea shanties, but gloriously atmospheric, and it's a wonderful, wonderful piece. So absolutely, I mean, Judith Bingham is a composer who we should be embracing. We should be absolutely embracing. You know, I think she found all the furore over Prague quite amusing at the time. Looking back on it, she told me. But no, you're quite right. She's a fine composer.
Well, I got a funny feeling we've been joined by one of the greats of the class. I could say the classical word. Somebody who bestrides the brass world. Trumpet Jens. I got a funny feeling maybe Jens Lindemann, because I spoke to him a little bit earlier on today, or emailed him a little bit earlier. I think he's in Korea. He's out there, and yes, he comes back. I'm hoping to do something with him because he is just they're in the final parts of releasing. I think it's the Brandenburg concertos. I think I'm not 100% certain with this. With a group of the top brass players, and he says, marketing, a great narrative outside of the community to state that this is a performance of the highest order. I come from outside the banding world, and I'm blown away by the talent as well as the tradition.
Do you know, that's a fantastic thing to hear coming from somebody like Jens Lindemann, isn't it? I mean, that really is a fantastic thing to hear. Somebody that can actually look in from the outside, can see the talent, understands the tradition. So yeah, that's a great.
Oh, it's the Goldberg variations, not the Brandenburg, but the Goldberg variations.
Yeah,
there we are. He's just told me he's jet lagged in Korea. It's 3 a.m. out there. And knowing Jens, so I don't think he ever gets jet lagged. I have to say, mind you. The one thing I would say about Jens, never play darts with him. Okay, I'm terrible at darts, but Jens Lindemann, he couldn't, as they literally say, couldn't hit the cow's backside with a banjo with a dart in his hand. He's a lethal darts player.
Thank goodness he plays the trumpet fairly well.
He's a brilliant trumpet player. It's great, and I'm hoping to look after it. There we are. He says, just so the Goldberg is with himself, Richard Kelly, and band stars Owen Farr, David Childs, and Les Niche. Now, there is something that branches both the brass banding world and the classical world. What an absolute gem from that. Also, thanks very much, Stephen Lomas, bass trombone player, of course, with the Bourgeois and Thomas band. And he says it needs to appeal to the audience performers like brass band music, I think. Otherwise, it all becomes incredibly insular. Really a contest for bands only, and only then at the result at the end.
Yep.
He's absolutely. It's a point well made. I know he's celebrating from a fantastic performance from there, but when you put it in that context and say, if he's gone back to work, I'm quite sure when he walked into work, he would love to have told everybody, "Guess what I won on the weekend?" And most probably they were more interested about how Manchester City got on in the football or whatever like that. That's where the context sometimes comes from. That, but congratulations, Steve, and points well made as you did.
Yeah.
You talked about the purpose of what contests are about, and in the way. They're only about one thing, who's going to end up as the winner at the end of it, and then you just go on to the next one. So we'll do that. Anyway, back now on to our next point, because we're racing through this, and it's great to see with people. Thanks very much. The regional test pieces. And this is possibly a little bit the elephant in the room with a little bit there. They were announced... I think somebody snuck through it with the announcements before they should have been done at the Cheltenham Festival, at the Cheltenham National Finals. Championship section, Alga Variations, Martin Ellaby. First section, Variations on, I think it's Was La Bête, Andrew Wainwright. I don't know if my German is very good. Second section, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Philip Harper. Interesting one.
Yep.
3 Haworth, I don't know say that.
Yeah,
Haworth Impressions by Gordon Langford. I think that's all about the Brontes. The fourth section, Indian Summer. Now, we'll touch on Indian Summer in a moment, because that's the one that's really caused the great debate. Nice to see Elgar back. The Elgar Variations by Martin Ellaby. It's a long time since that was played, 2007 at the European Championships. Andrew's piece I heard at the Dutch National Championships. And again, talk about a composer who's got craftsmanship. He's a really good craftsman. It's a set of variations on a theme, but the way in which he's actually put it together, so well structured.
Yeah, I must confess I've not heard that piece yet. But I'm just really pleased to see something by Andrew Wainwright on there, because he's a talented guy. Great to see something that's new to the bands as well. So I'm really pleased to see that, and looking forward to having a listen to it over the coming days.
Well, that's great stuff there. Interesting piece from Philip Harper, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He's always inspired by books and all that part, science fiction as well, because he did the what's it called? Something on the moon, wasn't it? Explorers on the Moon, which was Tintin. And
Tintin,
this one is about the Jules Verne, of course, Captain Nemo Under the Sea. So that's going to be an interesting one. The Gordon Langford piece, talking about, again, put it into context about a composer who bridged two different mediums. He bridged about 25 different mediums because he could write for anybody. It's a wonderful piece. He didn't write a lot of original music, but what he did write were absolute gems if you play the symphony at it, etc.
Well, I love that. I love that piece. I sat and listened to it again last night. I'd not listened to it for a long time, and it still sounds very fresh. I mean, it's beautifully crafted. It's so well written. The harmonies are luscious. I mean, it's so beautifully written, and I think the bands will enjoy playing it. I mean, some bands might know it, some bands might not, but actually, I think that piece is a really good choice.
Okay, then. So, as we talked about, the one out of usually there's a lot of debate about what the regional championship works are. There hasn't been really much debate about 4 of the 5 sections. But the one that really did, and interestingly, was the 4th section piece, which was Indian Summer by Eric Ball. Written in 1950, first used at regional championships in the same year, has been revived in competition for some time. It is music of its time, and it reflects a limited understanding and a depiction of Native American culture in its 4 movements. The Great Chief speaks by the cool waters, totem dance, and hymn to the Great Spirit. And that dated side of it comes from the narrative forward. So let's put it straight out there. If we're going to say, was Eric Ball, a question that arose from Peter Denton. I've known Peter for a long time. Very thoughtful musician, somebody who, really well educated. He knows his music. Yeah. And he put out the question, and he said, does anyone else think that Eric Ball's Indian Summer is a racist work? Now, unfortunately, what happened, of course, that this binary debate goes on: is them and us. You're a racist. You get your head wobbling and all this sort of stuff. Yeah. They failed to see what the broader context of it was in respect to it. Nobody is suggesting in any way, shape, or form it was that Eric Ball was a racist. That was never ever in question. Is Indian Summer a racist work? Well, no, because it's the same thing. And I'll have to say this part of it. In the context, it was not written to implicitly promote a racist ideology, although it does reflect outdated stereotypes in its narrative forward. Yeah, and once you look at that, then that's the context that you have to look at in total. Even Ball himself, writing at the time, he said, the title and subtitles of this piece will perhaps appeal to the eternal boy within us all. I think that is part of it there. 1950s, you're looking at, the Hollywood films of the 1940s, etc. Just before the start of television in America, which was bringing us, I think you had Stagecoach and had all these different television shows in the 1950s, which was very stereotypical of their time and brought us music that was written by the Hollywood studios over time. But he also goes on, but it may also stimulate the imagination of those who know the red skin to have been at his best, a highly intelligent, sensitive and spiritual being. Now, the description there is something which is outdated, is naive at best, and is not used in any form today. So, again, placing it into context, in 1950, when Indian Summer was written, there's Dennis Taylor wrote a thesis on Eric Ball's work. I think it's Salford University. And in 1950, he also wrote a selection of Harry Lauder songs, a suite called His Majesty's Ships, 5 songs from The Wizard of Oz, and Resurgam, all in that 1950. So you would be hard pressed to say that at the same time he was possibly promoting anti-Scottish sentiment with Harry Lauder, British high seas imperialism with His Majesty's Ships, allegorical symbolism, or family, what is called anaesthesism, which is resurrectionism. That's a great word, isn't it, from that part? Nobody would ever suggest that. But because of the way in which the arguments developed on there, it became almost poisonous. And the level of debate just degenerated on what initially was a very interesting and I think a very intelligent approach to a complex question. I
think the question was largely misinterpreted, wasn't it, for a start, which is the big problem and what you've just alluded to. My belief is that you can't take Indian Summer out of the historical context in which it was written, and that's the context which you have just outlined. It's stereotypical, yes, it's naive, but it's of an age, it's of a period when Eric Ball, frankly, wouldn't have known anything different. And also, there's no malice in that piece, Ewan. I mean, it's actually, when you look at it, I think it's quite affectionate, actually. I think it's actually quite, as you say, it's a bit boy's own. It's a bit John
Comes
Wayne.
and it does come from a Christian perspective. I don't think there's any with that part of it there. But again, it's of its time.
It is of its time. The question for me isn't the point that you've just been making. The question is it suitable? Is it a good choice as a fourth section test piece for the regional championships next year? That for me is the question, because there's no doubt that the piece is what it is, and actually it's a much loved piece to many people as well.
I think it's a point that Sandy Smith, who was on the panel, and when I spoke to him about this, he really did emphasise. It was discussed. That broader, wider context was discussed, and I think it will be ensured that when it is performed, it will be explained to the audience, and hopefully the people who are the conductors of the bands will explain to younger people, etc., or all their members of the bands, to place it in that right context. But as I said to you, there is no way in which Eric Ball deliberately set out to do that. The music doesn't do that in his part there. And it's interesting, because I was doing a little bit of research with regards to this. There was a musicologist and semiotician called Jean-Jacques Natiez, and he says, he describes how to look at works like this. He says two dominant ways in which we construct musical learning: the poetic, which reads a score in light of its creator's intentions, methods, and cultural context, and the aesthetic, which takes into account the perceptions of an audience. We live in a determinedly poetic age. We give great stress to what artists do and say, particularly when they stray from contemporary moral norms. The project of demystification is often useful, given the rampant idealization and idolatry of prior eras. But listeners need not to be captive to the surface meaning of the scores, or to the biographies of their creators, or to the histories that accompany them.
We're getting deeply philosophical tonight, Ewan, I think.
It is, but when you read that and then you place that with Eric Ball, that's what comes of it. All of a sudden then, that is it. And I think Sandy has come back to us. He says, I've been told today that one community band who have never contest will be taking part in 2026 because of Indian Summer.
Fantastic.
And I'm quite sure, again, this has been explained to them, the context of it, the age of it, and all that part of it there. And as Sandy, I think, has also very, very clearly pointed out, it is structured in a way which allows bands, community bands, etc., who may be reduced in number, in personnel, to still go on stage and give a performance of it.
Absolutely. And I think Dean Woods has just come back with a similar comment, Ewan, saying there's talk locally of former EBU players coming back together to enter the fourth section. These are non-players now. Therefore, the piece selection is doing its job. I think it's a great choice. They're the sort of things we want to hear, aren't they? People that are getting together to play music that they want to play, bringing players and bands into the fourth section that wouldn't have otherwise participated. Fantastic.
It is, and again, the context is everything. Alec Gallagher has come back there. He said, compared to how Native Americans have been treated by the immigrants who now populate the USA, Ball's efforts seem rather harmless, rather tongue-in-cheek, I think, from Alec there. But again, if we have the right context, if we're able to look at things in a much more nuanced way, and this is one of the positive things that came out of Peter Dent and Iwan, as we said, I've known for many, many years. Yeah. But we need people to challenge what we think is wrong or right, whatever, and put out the questions, and then offer, hopefully, that we'll have debate which is nuanced and subtle and looks at both points of view. The problem that we've got on the internet, it becomes so binary that in the end, it just became personal abuse, and that was a really, really shameful thing on many people who involved themselves in doing that.
Yeah, I mean, there were so many precedents, Ewan. We were talking earlier about a piece that was extremely popular in the early 1900s, Hiawatha's Wedding Feast by Samuel Coleridge Taylor. Yeah. A similar idealized, stereotypical piece of writing in some ways. A choral piece, used poetry by an American. Samuel Coleridge Taylor, interesting because he was an English composer. He was born in London. He was mixed race. His mother was English. His father was Creole from Sierra Leone, I think, if I remember rightly. So this was a mixed race composer writing using poetry that you could actually look at in a similar way to some people have commented on Indian summer. So, you have to, again, we keep talking about context. We have to keep things in context.
I think it's important. It's interesting. We talk about Eric Ball as a white Christian composer from 1950 writing it. You've got a black English composer in 1903 writing about something which is based on poetry from the late 19th century. And any connection that these people had to what was actually happening in the US at the time must have been so limited. And of course, it was so prejudiced at the time, the reporting that it was given that was coming out of the US at the time. So it's a very, very interesting. I think
we can't rewrite musical history, Ewan, can we?
No, we can't. And of course,
we can't rewrite it.
And as you say, if you go into the classical music field, and this brings us to the last point for our discussion tonight, really, of possible the cancel culture that we have in music. You've been, you've sat in so many concerts, in classical concerts. What happens if Wagner turns up? What happens if Karl Orff? Now, there's a complex man. If you want to read about all these type of people there. They must have that wider understanding of where the music comes within the great canon of things. And as I say, going back to that quote I say from Jean-Jacques Nattiez, to look at it, you've got to scratch below the surface.
Yes.
Then you find out a little bit more. Then you could put it placed in there. With regards to, changing things or cancelling things, concerts now going on in Bristol used to be the Colston Hall.
Yes.
Mr. Colston was a man, was famously his statue was ripped down and was thrown into the river there. Actually inspired a great piece of music by a composer called Ian Stevens called I think it was called Colston Falls. Only a 5-minute piece. Philip Harper premiered it. So everything has got that connection as well. It's now called Colston Hall is now called the Beacons.
Yes.
I don't think anybody bats an eyelid now with regards to it. They go to it and they go to the events there. And as you say, there is music that we don't want to hear again. Is the music of the black and white minstrels, etc., and all that type of music, which was deliberately written in such a way that it was about suppression. It was about making sure that that attitude was reinforced. That horrible.
The context, as you say, is very different. Yeah, very different.
It is. So that part of it there. So that'll be very interesting. As I say, if we been through the brass band repertoire, what about the Crusaders, Clive of India? Now, there's an interesting piece because that was originally called 1914.
Yeah.
And because it was written in the time in the war when Britain was having a bit of a bash, and they called it Clive of India to try and give everybody a patriotic lift. And possibly one of the most unpatriotic people of all was Clive of India. So they got that one. Oliver Cromwell, there's the one if you're going back in history. So and even in concert.
Well, there's a piece by Elgar called "The Crown of India," isn't there, which is very much rooted in the days of the Raj, etc. And you could apply certain arguments to that as well, Ewan. Again, it's all down to historical context.
And to the wider, coming back to context, the wider musical world has already embraced this. And not everybody's on board with it, etc. But the way in which the Proms has moved over the last 5 or 6 years, etc., is much more progressive in his outlook and his understanding and his explanation of why works are actually being played. And really, brass band movement has just got to catch up with that. And if we do it in a progressive way, if we do it in a positive way, then we can actually embrace different pieces and put them in that right context and then still get them performed. As you said, there are other ones that we can't do that with, but there are a great number that can be done as long as we open ourselves up to have a subtle, much more informed and nuanced debate about their inspiration, etc. So that brings us then to the future then to finish off, Chris. So we've got the last 5 minutes. How do we shape that debate then for the future? As you say, people such as Sandy have put forward their point of view, and it's great that if it means that we have greater participation, especially at fourth section level, that's a positive. That's actually come out from there. Yeah. So what do we do? Do we link up with festival premieres? Do we link up with what is actually happening in Europe? Because there are exciting things that are happening out there. Looking at the test pieces that have been picked for the Norwegian championships in recent years, the Swiss, the Dutch and the Belgian, they've looked in a different way. And they've looked in possibly in a different avenue. They have gone back and have linked into what's been happening in the UK. But, where else? I'll give you an idea. Which country had Myth Forest or Bard, variations on Michael Tippett, mutant sonorities?
Yeah, well, we know that's Norway, Ewan.
We know that's Norway. The Swiss have gone for Hypercue, Concerto Grosso, Eden, As If a Voice Were in Them. The Dutch have had Old Licks Bluesed Up in recent, and Red Bad, which was a great great piece of there. The Belgians have had Sinfonietta #2 by I think it's Savoyette, I think his name is.
Yes.
Rewrite Relapse by Stan Neuenhaus. You know, there's opportunities there, and if you go down further down the levels, etc. as well. In Switzerland especially, there's some great composers who write pieces for the lower sections, and they all reach outwards. They're all outward facing, trying to embrace a new audience and make it exciting. So we have something we can learn from that, and that would be a positive. We've got people, for instance, such as Ingeborg Wilhelmsen, who was the 2024 4Barsrest Newcomer of the Year. She wrote a piece called Embracing Duality, which was used at the European Brass Band Championship.
Really clever piece,
Yeah, wonderful composer. If we got people like that who are writing for us, the future can only look good for us. So do you think the future is looking good if we can do that, embracing those new voices, showing that ambition, and reaching out to those new audiences?
Well, first of all, Ian, we have to keep talking about it. That's the first thing. We are doing that, which is a positive step in itself. We have to keep talking about it, all of us. I think, secondly, one of the difficulties, and we could probably devote a complete podcast to this, one of the difficulties that we have to overcome is the balance, and I'm going to use that word context again, the balance and the context of the tradition of brass banding that we carry in the UK relative to some of the countries that you've just talked about, whose traditions are far younger than ours are. They have that progressive attitude. We have to learn to cultivate it, to let it evolve, but we also have to balance it. So, and I think, to be honest, that's probably a harder thing to do. But nonetheless, that's no reason why we shouldn't be trying to do it. Another thing, we've got to keep talking to composers. One piece that I know we've mentioned it before, we've not mentioned it tonight, is a new piece that Richard Blackford has written.
Orbital.
Richard Blackford, has never written for brass band before. We've talked about Hugh Watkins. We have to keep engaging with these composers. It's not the case that they have to write for the contest platform, Ewan. I mean, I was chatting with Eddie Gregson recently, who was saying, look, we have to lose the obsession with contesting. We have to try and move away from that obsession. Again, I think that's a difficult thing to do, but the point that Eddie was making was that actually some of these composers we should be actually encouraging to write, not necessarily for the contest platform. We should be bringing pieces into the repertoire through the concert hall, not the contest hall. And I think that's an extremely important point as well. We mustn't get bogged down with new voices purely writing contest pieces.
It's interesting, one last comment when it's come back through, Stephen Lomas has come back. He said, would you marginalise works based on contrary religious beliefs? Atheists must be outraged. Maybe, but this is the point that's really important with it. Maybe remove the textual preface and just focus on making good music. It's a pet.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a pet project with mine. The number of times you see forwards to pieces, which now are like mini novellas.
Yes.
Trying to explain everything about the piece, where literally you could say, this is what the piece is about, full stop, in about 2 sentences, and just listen to the music. Make up your own mind about the music. You don't have to have that reinforced to you, or as you say, pushed into you right at the beginning before you've actually heard.
There's almost a sense of composers having to try to justify the music that they've written by creating a long, rambling, sometimes somewhat pretentious preamble to the piece. If the music is good enough, it should stand on its own 2 feet with the minimum of description. It doesn't need an essay. It just needs to give people a guideline, because the music should say everything else.
Well, many thanks, Chris, for that. And many thanks, I have to say, to the people who've been joining us. Jens Lindemann, get to bed. It must be now about 4 o'clock in the morning, and he's still writing. The man never sleeps. He must be a vampire, I think, in a different life. But there we go for that one there. But we will be speaking to Jens, I'm hoping, in the next couple of weeks as well, about that great project about the Goldberg Variations. So we'll be doing that there. But Chris, many thanks for joining us there.
Pleasure,
We've had
Ewan.
an hour. Thank you for everybody who's actually joined us. I think it's been very,
Absolutely.
really
Thank
interesting
you.
for that part of it. What I would say to people, please subscribe. Please put down that you like, get us on there so we can keep doing these programs for you time and time again. So that's it. We'll be back in about, I think, a week
Couple
or
of
so's
weeks,
time.
couple of
Yeah,
weeks,
but I think
yeah,
the 8th of
yeah.
October, ahead of the national finals at the Royal Albert Hall. As I say, then it's going to be a busy period for us listening to music at all levels and of all sorts. So, Chris, many thanks for joining us, and good night to everybody, wherever you are in the world.
Indeed.